Victor was the kind of man people noticed the moment he walked into a room. His tall frame, shiny designer suit, and the loud sound of his expensive shoes clicking against the floor always drew attention. He carried himself like the world belonged to him, and in many ways, he believed it did. Victor had built his wealth through aggressive business tactics, buying smaller companies and showing no mercy to those who stood in his way. He loved to remind others of his success, never missing a chance to brag about his money, cars, or properties. To him, life was all about power and control, and anyone who didn't match his lifestyle was beneath him. One sunny afternoon, Victor entered a luxurious restaurant located in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place where wealthy people went to be seen, where golden chandeliers sparkled above marble floors, and waiters moved swiftly, carrying trays of expensive dishes. Victor often came here, not only for the food but also to show off. He liked how the staff rushed to serve him, how other customers whispered his name, and how people looked at him with a mix of envy and respect. Today, however, something unusual caught his attention. In one corner of the restaurant sat a woman who didn't seem to belong. Her clothes were plain and simple, not torn or dirty, but not designer, not glamorous, not the kind of fashion usually found in that restaurant. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she sat with a calm expression as she quietly ate a modest meal. She wasn't scrolling through her phone, wasn't calling for attention, and didn't seem interested in what others thought. She just sat there peacefully, enjoying her food. Victor's eyes narrowed. To him, the woman seemed out of place in such a luxurious setting. The wealthy customers around him were eating dishes that cost hundreds of dollars, while her plate looked simple, something far less expensive than what he was used to ordering. Instead of minding his own business, Victor felt an urge to prove his superiority. His arrogance always pushed him to belittle those who appeared weaker or less fortunate. He walked past her table deliberately, his voice loud enough for others around to hear. "Well, isn't this interesting?" he said with a mocking laugh. "I didn't know this place served budget meals." His words carried a sharp edge, designed to sting. Several customers glanced over, sensing the cruelty behind his tone. The woman, whose name was Maria, simply looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, steady, and free of anger. She didn't react the way Victor expected. Most people he mocked either turned red with embarrassment, looked away, or tried to defend themselves nervously. But Maria just offered a polite smile, then returned to her food. Victor wasn't satisfied. He thrived on attention, on making people laugh at his jokes even if they were cruel. He pulled out a chair at the next table, sitting down loudly as if to claim the space with his presence. "You know," he continued, his voice echoing in the restaurant, "some places aren't for everyone. This is an exclusive restaurant. You need to belong here. And I don't mean just paying for a plate. You have to look the part, live the life, understand what luxury means." The waiters exchanged nervous looks. They had seen Victor bully others before but never dared to intervene. He was too important, too powerful. Losing him as a customer could mean losing their jobs. Still, a quiet tension filled the air as people began to notice what was happening. Maria, however, didn't show the slightest sign of discomfort. She slowly put down her fork, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and then looked at Victor again. Her expression was neutral, her eyes kind yet firm, as if she had seen this kind of arrogance many times before. Instead of replying, she calmly resumed eating. Victor laughed mockingly. "Silence, hey? That's what I thought. People like you are just ordinary. You don't understand what it means to be successful, to have class. Don't worry, maybe one day you'll save enough to buy a proper meal here." His voice was dripping with sarcasm. Some customers lowered their heads, pretending not to listen, while others whispered quietly to each other. A few even felt anger rising inside, but they didn't dare to speak up. Victor's reputation was well known. He could ruin people with a single phone call. But what unsettled them all was Maria's reaction, or rather, her lack of it. She didn't let his words affect her. She continued with a quiet dignity, as though she knew something that Victor didn't. Her silence was not weakness, but strength. Victor leaned back in his chair, smiling smugly as though he had won some invisible battle. In his mind, humiliating Maria made him feel powerful, and he thought others were admiring him for it. But in truth, most of the customers were beginning to feel pity for Maria and even more disgust for Victor. When the waiter came to bring Victor his usual expensive meal, Victor made another comment, loudly enough for Maria to hear. "Bring the lady a glass of water, it's probably the only thing she can afford." He laughed at his own joke, but this time, no one joined him. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Maria finished her meal slowly, stood up with grace, and nodded politely to the waiter who had served her. She paid her bill without hesitation and prepared to leave. Before walking out, she looked back at Victor. Her eyes didn't hold anger or shame, they held something far more unsettling to him, quiet confidence. She said nothing, but that look stayed with him. Victor brushed it off, pretending not to care. To him, she was just a simple woman, not worth a second thought. But what he didn't know was that the encounter in that restaurant was only the beginning. The quiet woman he had mocked so freely was not who he thought she was, and soon, his arrogance would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. The restaurant returned to its usual chatter once Maria left, but an invisible weight lingered in the air. The staff and customers exchanged glances, silently wondering why she hadn't fought back. Yet some felt an unusual respect for her. She had faced cruelty with composure, something few people could manage. Victor, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, sipping his expensive drink, convinced that the day was going exactly as he wanted. He had shown off his power once again. He had reminded everyone that he was rich, important, and untouchable. But what Victor failed to understand was that true strength isn't in mocking others. True dignity isn't in wealth or expensive meals. And sometimes, the people who look the simplest carry the greatest power that doesn't need to be announced, but is revealed at the right time. And Maria was one of those people. The next afternoon, Victor woke up with his usual confidence. He looked at himself in the mirror, fixing his tie and adjusting the golden cufflinks that shone brightly against his white shirt. He was preparing for what he believed would be one of the most important meetings of his career. A group of investors was coming into town, and he was certain that once they heard his presentation, they would pour their money into his company. He had practiced his speech many times, making sure every word would show off his brilliance, his success, and his dominance in the market. Victor's driver dropped him off at the same hotel where the restaurant was located. The hotel had a grand conference hall reserved just for big events. As he entered, the staff greeted him with forced smiles. They had seen his arrogance before, but they dared not show their true feelings. Victor enjoyed this kind of reception. It reminded him that people respected him or at least feared him. The meeting wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour, so Victor decided to stop by the restaurant again. As he walked through the doors, he scanned the room, half expecting people to whisper about him. He loved being the center of attention. But then his eyes fell on something that made him pause for a moment. At a table near the window sat Maria, the same woman he had mocked the day before. She was dressed the same way, in plain clothes, and was again eating a simple meal with quiet calmness. Victor smirked to himself. Unbelievable, he thought. She came back again. Some people just don't learn. He couldn't resist. He walked past her table, giving her a sarcastic smile. Back so soon? I suppose you found another cheap option on the menu. His voice was dripping with arrogance, and a couple of diners turned to look at him. Maria looked up, met his eyes, and gave a small nod. She said nothing, just as before, and returned to her meal. Her silence irritated Victor more than anything else. He was used to people reacting, defending themselves, or at least showing embarrassment. But Maria gave him nothing. To him, it felt like she was ignoring his power. He pulled out his phone and started talking loudly about his upcoming meeting, making sure everyone in the restaurant heard. Yes, the investors will be here soon. It's going to be a billion-dollar deal. Only people like me get opportunities like this. Others, well, they can only dream. He glanced at Maria while saying those last words, hoping she would feel small. But she didn't even look at him. After finishing his coffee, Victor stood up, straightened his suit jacket, and walked out proudly. Maria, coincidentally, also stood up around the same time. She paid her bill quietly and walked toward the same hallway that led to the hotel's conference halls. Victor noticed this but assumed she must be a staff member or perhaps an assistant to someone attending the meeting. He smirked again. Figures, he thought. She probably cleans up after these events. That's her place. The hotel's private meeting room was buzzing with activity. Assistants were setting up laptops, waiters were arranging glasses of water, and company representatives were gathering in small groups, nervously discussing what they would say. Victor entered with his usual air of superiority, and immediately people turned to greet him. He loved that moment, the handshakes, the flattering smiles, the respect in their voices when they said his name. He felt like a king walking into his palace. Victor went straight to the front, where his presentation was already displayed on a large screen. He tested the clicker in his hand, rehearsing in his mind how he would impress the investors. They'll have no choice but to invest, he thought confidently. A hush fell over the room when the main doors opened. Everyone turned their heads toward the entrance, waiting to see the lead investor who would decide the fate of many companies that day. Victor straightened his tie, ready to charm whoever walked in. But when he saw who it was, his jaw almost dropped. It was Maria. She walked into the room with calm authority, her steps confident, her presence commanding without effort. She was no assistant, no staff member, she was the very person everyone had been waiting for. She was the lead investor, the one who held the power to choose which companies would rise and which would fall. The same woman Victor had mocked not once, but twice, was now sitting at the head of the table, in the most important seat of the room. The silence was heavy. Some of the company representatives whispered in surprise, while others watched Victor carefully, waiting to see his reaction. His face turned pale, and for a moment, he lost his usual arrogance. But he quickly forced a smile and clapped his hands. Ah, wonderful! What a surprise! I didn't expect to see you here. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. Maria didn't respond to his comment. She simply nodded at the other attendees and asked the meeting to begin. Her calmness was more powerful than any loud words Victor could have spoken. She didn't need to remind anyone of what had happened in the restaurant. Everyone who had been there already knew, and those who hadn't could sense the tension in the room. Victor began his presentation, trying to regain control of the situation. He spoke louder than usual, adding extra charm to his words. He bragged about his company's profits, his leadership, his vision for the future. He flashed his confident smile and used big words to sound impressive. But behind his confident tone, his mind was racing. He kept glancing at Maria, trying to read her expression. She remained calm and quiet, listening carefully, showing no sign of being impressed or angry. As the minutes passed, Victor's nerves grew. He had never felt this way before. He was used to being in control, to being the one who judged others. But now, the roles were reversed. The woman he had looked down on was the one with the power to decide his company's future. When he finished his presentation, the room was silent. Victor smiled awkwardly, expecting applause or at least nods of agreement. Instead, all eyes turned to Maria. She placed her hands gently on the table, looked around the room, and then her eyes landed on Victor. For the first time, she spoke directly about what she had seen. Success, she said softly but firmly, is not measured by how loudly a man boasts or how much wealth he shows off. It is measured by how he treats others, especially those he thinks have nothing. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. Victor's smile froze. He felt as if the floor beneath him had disappeared. The same people who had once admired him now looked at him differently. They saw not a leader, but a man who had mocked the very person they were all there to impress. Maria didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, and didn't seek revenge in that moment. She simply showed the truth that character mattered more than appearances. And as Victor sat there, his confidence slipping away, he realized that his world was about to change forever. The conference hall was silent for a long moment after Maria spoke. Her calm voice had carried more weight than Victor's long and boastful presentation. The people seated around the large table shifted in their chairs, whispering quietly, their eyes moving from Victor to Maria. Victor tried to hold his usual confident smile, but inside he felt uneasy. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't the man in control. Maria, however, didn't rush to speak again. She calmly sipped her glass of water and looked over the papers in front of her, as though nothing unusual had happened. That quiet confidence made Victor sweat. He wanted to explain himself, to smooth over what had happened in the restaurant, but he didn't know how. He had insulted her twice in public, and now she was the one everyone wanted to impress. One of the other businessmen cleared his throat nervously and tried to change the subject. He began talking about his own project, hoping to catch Maria's attention. Victor leaned back, pretending to listen, but his mind was racing. He thought about how foolish he must have looked yesterday, mocking her for her plain clothes and her simple meal. Now he realized those clothes hadn't been a sign of weakness or poverty, they had been a choice. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need fancy jewelry or loud words. She had something Victor lacked: true dignity. As the next speaker finished, Maria nodded politely and asked a few thoughtful questions. Her voice was steady, her eyes sharp, and her words carried weight. It became clear to everyone in the room that she wasn't just wealthy, she was intelligent, experienced, and wise. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and made observations that revealed how deeply she understood the business world. Victor felt smaller and smaller in his seat. He tried to join in the conversation, making comments here and there, but each time he spoke, Maria's silence reminded him of the gap between them. It wasn't only about money anymore. It was about respect. Finally, Maria turned her gaze back to Victor. The room grew tense again. "You speak with confidence, Mr. Victor," she said gently, "but confidence is only valuable when it is supported by humility and respect." Victor nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yes, of course. Absolutely. Respect is very important to me." He stopped when he saw her raise a hand slightly, signaling him to let her continue. "I do not make decisions based only on numbers," Maria continued. "I look at the character of the people I work with. Business deals are not only about profit. They are about trust, values, and long-term relationships. A man who mocks others for their appearance or their meals," she paused, letting her words sink in, "may find that he is not ready for true leadership." The silence was heavy. Everyone in the room knew exactly what she was referring to, even those who hadn't been in the restaurant. Victor felt heat rush to his face. He wanted to defend himself, to say something, but he knew anything he said would only make him look worse. The meeting moved forward, but Victor couldn't focus. His mind kept replaying the moment in the restaurant when he had laughed at Maria. How could he have been so blind? He had spent years believing he was the most powerful man in any room, but today proved otherwise. After the meeting ended, the investors began to leave the hall in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some glanced at Victor with pity, others with judgment. They knew he had lost more than just dignity that day. He had lost the chance to gain Maria's support. Victor tried to approach her before she left. He forced a smile and walked quickly toward her. "Miss Maria," he said nervously, "I just want to say it's all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to offend you yesterday. I was only joking." Maria turned to face him, her expression calm but serious. "Jokes reveal more about a person than they realize," she replied softly. "When a man laughs at others, he is often hiding his own weaknesses." Victor opened his mouth to respond but found no words. For the first time, his charm failed him. Maria picked up her bag, gave a polite nod, and walked out of the hall with quiet dignity. As she left, Victor stood frozen, feeling as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. His employees, who had once admired him, now avoided his eyes. They had witnessed his humiliation, and they knew his arrogance had finally caught up with him. Later that evening, Victor sat alone in his office, staring at the city skyline from his glass window. The lights of the city usually gave him pride, reminding him of the empire he had built. But tonight, they felt cold and distant. He thought about Maria's words again and again. "A man who mocks others may find he is not ready for true leadership." The sentence echoed in his mind like a bell he couldn't escape. For the first time, he began to wonder if his way of living was wrong. He thought about the countless people he had mocked, humiliated, or pushed aside in his climb to the top. He remembered the faces of waiters, clerks, assistants, people he had dismissed as unimportant. And now, one of those simple people had turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. He felt regret, but pride still held him back. He couldn't bring himself to fully admit his mistake, not yet. To the outside world, he still wanted to appear confident, untouchable. But deep inside, he knew something had changed. The mask of arrogance no longer fit as easily as before. Meanwhile, Maria returned to her quiet life. She didn't talk about what had happened. She didn't post on social media or boast to others about putting Victor in his place. She simply continued her work, investing in companies, supporting communities, and living by her values. For her, true power wasn't about showing off. It was about lifting others up, not pushing them down. People who had witnessed both encounters, the restaurant and the meeting, told the story to others. Soon, it spread quietly through the city. A rich bully had mocked the wrong woman, only to discover she was the very investor he needed. And she had handled him with grace, not anger. The story became a lesson that people repeated: never judge others by their appearance, because you never know who they truly are. Victor, sitting alone in his luxury office, realized that the respect he once demanded from others had always been shallow. People feared him, but they didn't truly admire him. Maria, on the other hand, didn't demand respect, she earned it. That difference burned inside him. As the night grew darker, Victor knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. The days after the meeting were some of the longest in Victor's life. He walked through his company halls with his usual polished suit, but the confidence in his stride was not the same. Employees noticed the difference. Before, his footsteps were heavy, almost arrogant, echoing loudly down the marble floors. Now, though he tried to hide it, there was a tension in his walk, as if he was carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. In the conference rooms, people spoke in hushed voices about what had happened. The story of Maria, the simple woman he had mocked, had spread like wildfire. Investors from other firms whispered about it during lunches, journalists hinted at it in their articles, and even Victor's business rivals chuckled behind closed doors. They all found it unbelievable that Victor, the man who prided himself on knowing everyone who mattered, had publicly humiliated someone far more powerful than himself. Victor's pride burned, but what hurt most was the truth he could not run from: he had lost Maria's trust, and along with it, the chance for the biggest investment his company had ever seen. His board of directors, once blindly loyal to him, now questioned his decisions. Some of them even hinted that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. One morning, as Victor sat in his corner office staring at the skyline, his assistant entered nervously. "Sir," she said carefully, "we've received word that another company, one of our competitors, has just secured Maria's investment." Victor's heart sank. He had been expecting bad news, but hearing it confirmed felt like a heavy blow. He dismissed his assistant with a wave of his hand and leaned back in his chair. For a long time, he just sat there in silence. In his mind, he saw Maria's calm eyes again, the way she had looked at him without anger, just quiet disappointment. That look was more powerful than any harsh word. It haunted him because it wasn't filled with hate, it was filled with truth. And the truth was that Victor had built his empire on fear and arrogance, not on respect. That evening, Victor attended a networking dinner. Normally, he enjoyed such events, relishing the chance to show off his wealth and charm. But this time, he noticed something different. When he walked into the glittering banquet hall, people didn't rush toward him like before. Conversations didn't stop in awe. Instead, there were sideways glances, polite nods, and then people turned back to their groups. For the first time, Victor wasn't the center of attention. He was just another man in a suit. He tried to join a group of investors, but the conversation grew awkward. One of them even mentioned Maria's name with admiration. "She's remarkable," the man said. "A rare leader who combines wealth with wisdom. The way she carries herself unshakable." Another added, "Unlike some people who think money gives them the right to insult others." Victor forced a laugh, but inside, he was crumbling. He excused himself early from the dinner, claiming he had urgent business, and returned home to his empty penthouse. The silence of the place weighed on him. The grand chandelier above his dining room table sparkled, but it brought no comfort. His expensive furniture, his art pieces, his view of the city, they all seemed meaningless now. He poured himself a drink but barely touched it. Instead, he sat on his leather couch, staring at nothing. For the first time in years, he began to question his choices. He thought back to his childhood, to when he was just a boy with dreams of success. Back then, he had promised himself that he would rise above poverty, that he would never be humiliated the way his family once had been. Somewhere along the way, that determination had twisted into arrogance. He had mistaken cruelty for strength, and pride for power. The next day, Victor returned to work, determined to repair his image. He called for another meeting, gathering his top managers in the boardroom. He spoke loudly, trying to sound confident. "We must focus on the future," he said. "We don't need Maria's investment. We can survive without it." But even as he spoke, he saw the doubt in his managers' eyes. They didn't believe him. Some of them even avoided eye contact, as though ashamed of being associated with him. For the first time, Victor realized he was losing not just investors, but the respect of his own people. That afternoon, he received a call from one of his old business friends. The man hesitated before speaking. "Victor. I say this as a friend. You need to understand something. People are talking. They say you've lost touch with reality. They say your arrogance is costing you everything. Maria isn't just an investor, she's a symbol. By disrespecting her, you've shown the whole world who you really are. If you don't change, you'll be left behind." Victor hung up the phone without answering. But the words cut deep. Later, he found himself driving through the quieter parts of the city. He wasn't sure why, but he ended up passing by a community center with Maria's name on the entrance. Out of curiosity, he stopped the car and watched from a distance. Through the large windows, he saw Maria talking with a group of young entrepreneurs. They were dressed simply, just like she always was, and they listened to her with shining eyes. She wasn't sitting at the head of a luxurious boardroom this time. She was among ordinary people, offering advice, guiding them, encouraging them. Victor stayed in his car, hidden, watching the scene. A strange feeling grew in his chest. It wasn't just regret, it was something else. Admiration. Respect. He had mocked her for being simple, but now he saw that simplicity was her strength. She didn't need to show off wealth to prove her power. Her actions, her wisdom, and her kindness spoke louder than any luxury could. As he drove away, Victor knew he was standing at a crossroads. One path would lead him further down the road of arrogance, pride, and eventual ruin. The other path, the harder one, would require humility, change, and rebuilding. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which choice he would make. At his office that night, he sat in the dark, the city lights glowing outside. His phone buzzed with messages, emails, reminders of his crumbling deals. But he ignored them. His mind was fixed on Maria's calm words, the ones that had echoed in his head ever since the meeting: confidence is only valuable when it is supported by humility and respect. Victor leaned forward, placed his head in his hands, and whispered to himself, "What have I done?" He didn't know if Maria would ever give him a second chance. But he knew one thing clearly now: if he wanted to earn respect again, he had to change. Not for investors, not for appearances, but for himself. And for the first time in years, Victor felt something he had almost forgotten. The sting of regret. The weeks that followed were filled with challenges for Victor. Deals that once seemed certain began to collapse. Investors who had always trusted his vision suddenly backed away. Partners who had called him a genius now grew distant. It was as if Maria's rejection had opened everyone's eyes, and they no longer feared his wealth or his arrogance. Victor had always thought money was enough to keep people close. But as the days passed, he realized how wrong he had been. Money could buy admiration for a moment, but it could never buy true respect. And once respect was gone, wealth felt empty. One afternoon, as he sat in his office staring at reports filled with red numbers, his assistant entered timidly. "Sir," she whispered, "the board has called for an emergency meeting. They want to discuss leadership changes." Victor knew what that meant. His empire, built with years of hard work but also with pride and cruelty, was slipping out of his hands. He would soon lose control of the very company he had once ruled like a king. That night, unable to sleep, Victor drove through the quiet streets of the city. He passed glowing billboards advertising luxury cars, designer watches, and grand penthouses. All the things he once desired now seemed meaningless. For the first time in his life, he asked himself, what good is success if I have no respect? What good is wealth if I stand alone? By chance, his car passed once again by Maria's community center. This time, something urged him to stop. He parked across the street and watched as lights glowed warmly inside. Through the glass doors, he saw Maria speaking with a group of young men and women. They weren't dressed in expensive suits, but they were filled with energy, passion, and hope. Maria stood among them, listening carefully, guiding them with patience, offering wisdom without arrogance. Victor couldn't tear his eyes away. He realized this was real leadership, not ruling by fear, but inspiring by example. Not demanding respect, but earning it naturally. In that moment, he understood why Maria was admired everywhere she went. The next morning, Victor made a decision. For the first time in his career, he walked into a meeting without boasting, without showing off, without pretending to be untouchable. Instead, he stood before his board of directors and said words they never expected to hear from him. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice steady but humble. "I let arrogance guide me instead of respect. I mocked people I should have valued. I thought money was enough to prove my worth, but I see now it isn't. I have lost trust, and I don't blame anyone but myself." The room was silent. Some board members were stunned. Others exchanged doubtful looks. But for those who had known Victor for years, there was something different in his tone. He sounded sincere. One director leaned forward. "What do you plan to do about it?" Victor took a deep breath. "Change. Not just for this company, but for myself. I don't expect instant forgiveness, but I will earn it. Not with words, but with actions." It wasn't a speech filled with pride or promises of billions. It was simple. Honest. For once, Victor spoke like a man, not like a king. Still, his board decided to remove him from his position. Victor accepted it quietly. There was no argument, no angry outburst, no threats. He simply nodded, thanked them for their service, and walked out of the boardroom for the last time. Many thought this was the end of Victor's story. But it wasn't. Instead of drowning in self-pity, Victor began to rebuild. He visited small businesses in the city, not to buy them out, but to listen. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs, offering advice based on his years of experience, this time without arrogance. For the first time, people saw a different side of him, a man willing to admit his mistakes and work toward change. It wasn't easy. People still remembered his past. Some refused to trust him. Others mocked him, just as he had once mocked them. But Victor stayed patient. He knew respect wasn't earned overnight. One day, as he was leaving a small business seminar he had volunteered to attend, he heard a calm voice behind him. "You've changed." He turned and saw Maria standing there. She wore the same simple clothes, the same calm expression, but now her eyes carried something different, a small glimmer of approval. Victor swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "I was wrong in every way. But I'm trying to be better." Maria studied him for a long moment before nodding. Growth begins with humility. Many men have wealth, but few have the courage to face themselves. Keep walking this path. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn, day by day. Her words struck him deeply, but this time, they didn't sting. They gave him hope. Months passed, and Victor's life slowly took a new shape. He no longer had the grand company, the endless spotlight, or the constant praise. But he had something he had never truly possessed before: peace. His days were filled with smaller victories, helping a struggling young man find funding for his bakery, guiding a small team of women to launch their clothing business, mentoring a boy who dreamed of becoming an engineer. And though his wealth had lessened, his heart had grown richer. People who once feared him now approached him with respect. Not because of his past riches, but because of his present actions. The story of Victor and Maria remained a lesson in the city. People repeated it in cafes, offices, and homes: the rich bully who mocked the wrong simple woman, and the woman who taught him that true strength comes from humility. Victor never forgot that lesson. And though he still had regrets, he found something more valuable than all the gold, cars, and skyscrapers he had once shown off. He found redemption. Maria, on her part, never bragged about her victory. She never told the story as her triumph. To her, it wasn't about putting Victor down. It was about lifting him toward something better. She had always believed that respect and kindness carried more power than wealth and cruelty. And in the end, she was right. Victor learned that life doesn't punish arrogance immediately, but eventually, pride brings a fall. And sometimes, the very person you mock is the one who holds the key to your greatest lesson. That was the truth he would carry with him forever.